The post office's secret network, tracking mail and making connections for centuries. The humble post office, a seemingly innocuous entity we rely on for correspondence, has a history more secretive and layered than many might imagine. While most people associate the post office with the mere delivery of letters and packages, its role over the centuries has evolved far beyond that of a courier. The post office, as we know it today, has long held the ability to track communications and, more intriguingly, map out the connections between people and groups. Unbeknownst to many, it has functioned not just as a delivery service, but as a silent watcher, quietly cataloging who is communicating with whom and how often. The origins of mail surveillance stretch back further than one might expect. Long before the modern digital age made personal privacy a primary concern, governments realized the strategic value of intercepting and monitoring communication. Ancient empires like Rome and Egypt relied heavily on postal systems not just to ensure the transmission of messages, but also to exert control over information. In Egypt, messengers carrying royal decrees or military orders were often closely monitored. The reliability of these couriers was paramount, but so was the need to ensure that sensitive information did not fall into the wrong hands. This principle carried over to the Roman Empire, which established one of the first official postal systems, cursus publicus, primarily to serve the needs of the state and military. Letters sent within the empire were regularly inspected to ensure that rebellious factions weren't communicating treasonous ideas. Though this may not have constituted systematic tracking as we know it today, the seeds of mail surveillance had already been sown. When the United States established its own postal system in 1775, it was largely seen as a tool for facilitating communication across the expanding country. However, even in those early years, the post office was more than just a facilitator of connection, it was a tool for observing it. The post office in colonial America operated under tight governmental control, and mail between different factions was regularly intercepted and read, especially in the politically volatile years leading up to the American Revolution. Mail tampering became more common during periods of social and political unrest, such as during the Civil War. Union forces, for instance, actively intercepted Confederate communications, hoping to gather intelligence and track movements of Confederate sympathizers. It was in these formative years that the post office became a means not only of delivery, but also of intelligence gathering. By controlling the flow of information, the government could monitor political sentiment, track dissidents, and respond to perceived threats. As the post-Civil War period gave way to the Industrial Revolution, and the flow of mail increased with the rise of industry and business, so too did the potential for surveillance. The post office, by the late 1800s, was an established institution dealing with millions of letters and parcels every day. The sheer volume of communication increased exponentially, and with it, the need to keep track of who was sending what to whom. With the growing volume of mail came the need for a more sophisticated system of oversight. Postal inspectors became the backbone of this burgeoning surveillance system. The position of postal inspector was created to combat mail fraud, theft, and other crimes associated with the postal system. However, as the years went by, their role expanded significantly. By the late 19th century, postal inspectors were increasingly involved in the detection of more serious crimes. They were tasked with intercepting illegal goods, such as counterfeit currency, and investigating crimes like mail fraud. But beyond this, postal inspectors began to gather information on political dissidents and anarchists during times of social upheaval, such as the labor movements of the late 1800s. Mail became a key tool for authorities to monitor the spread of radical political ideologies and uncover organized crime syndicates. Mail fraud detection often required a close examination of correspondence, which paved the way for more invasive measures. If a letter was suspected of being fraudulent or criminal, it could be intercepted and opened. The government soon realized that this method could be applied to more than just cases of fraud. Postal inspectors were increasingly tasked with collecting intelligence on specific individuals and groups, particularly during times of social or political tension. The transition from merely delivering letters to systematically inspecting them was solidified during World War I, when the U.S. government established the Espionage Act of 1917. This act gave authorities the right to inspect any mail suspected of containing subversive or treasonous content. Postal inspectors were now key players in ensuring national security. The widespread censorship of anti-war publications and other potentially incendiary material became a standard practice. The sheer volume of mail meant that a manual inspection of every suspicious letter or package wasn't feasible. But even without physically opening each piece of mail, Inspectors could make educated guesses about the contents based on patterns in addresses, the types of materials used, and even the weight of packages. This practice laid the groundwork for the more sophisticated tracking systems that would emerge later. World War I marked the first major instance of postal services being used as a widespread tool for government surveillance. The war effort justified the interception and censorship of mail, and these practices continued well after the war ended. During the interwar period, postal inspectors continued their work, especially focusing on anti-government sentiment during the Great Depression and the growing influence of communist groups in the United States. It wasn't just the U.S. that employed mail surveillance as a tool. Many other countries, especially totalitarian regimes, saw the post office as a way to control information. In Nazi Germany, for instance, the mail was heavily censored, and individuals suspected of sending anti-regime messages were tracked down and often imprisoned. In the Soviet Union, the mail system was similarly co-opted by the state as a means of controlling dissent and spying on its citizens. Even though these examples come from oppressive regimes, the practice of mail surveillance in democratic countries raised ethical concerns as well. By the time World War II rolled around, postal inspectors in the U.S. were routinely intercepting and censoring mail in the name of national security, tracking communications between foreign nationals, and monitoring political dissidents on U.S. soil. The practice of monitoring mail in the name of security only increased during the Cold War. As tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union escalated, the U.S. government became increasingly paranoid about the threat of communist infiltration. The post office, once again, became a key tool in identifying potential threats. The role of the postal inspector was expanded further, and mail surveillance became one of the primary methods of tracking down suspected communist sympathizers. The digital age fundamentally transformed how the post office tracked and monitored mail. As communication technologies evolved, the systems used to manage and observe mail became more sophisticated. The introduction of barcodes, digital scanning, and later machine learning algorithms allowed the post office to track mail on an unprecedented scale. By the late 20th century, postal services around the world began utilizing digital systems to track the flow of mail. Barcodes became standard on every piece of mail, allowing postal workers to scan and monitor letters and packages at every stage of the delivery process. Initially, this was designed as a logistical tool to improve efficiency and prevent lost mail. However, it soon became apparent that this system could also be used to track individuals through their communications. The widespread use of barcodes meant that every letter and package could be tracked, from the moment it was dropped into the mailbox until it reached its final destination. This allowed the post office, as well as law enforcement agencies, to create detailed records of mail traffic between individuals and organizations. Patterns of communication could be easily identified, and these records could be used in criminal investigations or to monitor individuals suspected of wrongdoing. The 1990s brought a wave of advancements in imaging technologies that allowed the post office to take its surveillance capabilities even further. High-resolution scanners became standard in sorting facilities, allowing every piece of mail to be photographed and analyzed. The U.S. Postal Service in particular launched the Mail Isolation Control and Tracking (MICT) system in the wake of the anthrax attacks of 2001, marking a significant turning point in the relationship between the post office and government surveillance efforts. Under MICT, every piece of mail processed by the Postal Service was photographed, and those images were stored in a vast database for law enforcement agencies to access if necessary. While the program was initially presented as a national security measure, its scope quickly expanded. In theory, MICT was designed to help detect and track biological or chemical attacks through the mail. However, its capabilities also extended to tracking communication patterns between individuals, allowing for unprecedented levels of monitoring. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and Homeland Security, gained access to the vast trove of data generated by the MICT system. By analyzing this data, investigators could track the flow of mail between suspected criminals, identify criminal networks, and gather evidence in ongoing investigations. The use of mail tracking data became a powerful tool in cases involving organized crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism. But MICT wasn't limited to just criminal investigations. In practice, the system allowed the government to monitor virtually any mail sent within the U.S. Without a warrant, authorities could access photographs of any piece of mail and, if deemed necessary, cross-reference this information with other data sources such as phone records or online activity. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the lack of transparency and oversight, but the system continued to operate largely in the shadows. The advent of the digital age brought new layers of sophistication to mail surveillance. Machine learning algorithms, paired with the vast amounts of data generated by the tracking systems, allowed for more efficient analysis of communication patterns. The Postal Service no longer relied solely on human inspectors to review data. Instead, automated systems flagged suspicious activity, allowing for faster and more targeted investigations. The combination of digital tracking and imaging technologies meant that mail surveillance had reached a new level. Not only could the post office track who was sending mail to whom, but it could also create detailed profiles of individuals based on their correspondence habits. The government, and by extension law enforcement, now had access to a rich database of communication patterns across the country. For much of its history, the postal system operated under the assumption that the contents of a letter or package were private, unless a warrant was obtained to open it. But with the development of advanced imaging technologies, this principle was effectively rendered obsolete. Imaging technology allowed postal workers and law enforcement agencies to peer inside envelopes and packages without ever opening them. Originally, these technologies were developed to help detect dangerous substances, such as explosives or biological agents. Scanning machines could identify anomalies inside packages, ensuring that dangerous materials didn't enter the mail system. However, the potential for these technologies to be used for more invasive purposes soon became clear. X-ray machines, originally used for security purposes in airports and other high-risk areas, were adapted for use in postal sorting facilities. These machines could scan envelopes and packages to identify any suspicious materials, such as hidden weapons or illicit substances. While this was framed as a security measure, it also had the effect of erasing any expectation of privacy that individuals may have had when sending mail. The ability to scan mail without opening it meant that law enforcement agencies could now monitor the contents of letters without obtaining a warrant. In some cases, they could use advanced imaging techniques to reconstruct the contents of a letter without ever breaking the seal of the envelope. This capability fundamentally changed the relationship between the post office, the government, and the general public. No longer could people assume that their mail was private. The use of imaging technology wasn't limited to law enforcement. Private security firms, particularly those working in counterterrorism or corporate espionage, also began to use these tools to monitor mail. Companies could use imaging technologies to scan incoming mail for potential threats, but this often extended beyond legitimate security concerns. In some cases, companies used these technologies to track competitors or gather intelligence on individuals they considered a threat. While this level of surveillance was alarming to privacy advocates, it remained largely out of the public eye. The general public had little understanding of the capabilities of modern imaging technologies, and the post office did little to publicize its surveillance programs. The justification for these practices remained rooted in national security, but their implications were far-reaching. The ability to see through envelopes marked a turning point in mail surveillance. Once mail could be scanned and analyzed without being opened, the post office's role in intelligence gathering took on a new dimension. Every letter and package could now be scrutinized in detail, without the sender or recipient ever knowing. The physical privacy that had once been inherent in sending a letter was gone. As imaging technology continued to improve, its uses became more diverse. In the early 21st century, imaging systems were paired with AI-driven analysis tools that allowed for even more sophisticated monitoring. For instance, letters containing specific types of paper or ink could be flagged for further inspection. Packages with unusual weight distributions or chemical compositions could be isolated for more thorough scanning. These technological advancements, combined with the widespread implementation of systems like MICT, meant that the post office now had the ability to monitor mail on a scale never before imagined. Whether for security purposes, criminal investigations, or corporate espionage, the line between legitimate surveillance and invasive monitoring was increasingly blurred. As the post office's surveillance capabilities grew, so too did its importance to national security. The United States Postal Service, once seen as an everyday service, was now intricately involved in the nation's broader security infrastructure. At this point, the post office wasn't just delivering mail, it was a cornerstone of intelligence gathering. During the early 21st century, particularly after the 9/11 attacks, national security concerns reached unprecedented heights. As a result, the post office's tracking systems became more integrated into the broader security apparatus of the government. Agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, increasingly relied on mail tracking to monitor threats within the United States. Mail tracking became one of the most reliable ways to identify and locate suspected terrorists and extremist groups. Packages that contained explosive devices or biohazardous materials, such as the anthrax-laced letters sent in 2001, provided clear examples of how dangerous mail could be in the wrong hands. It wasn't just dangerous materials that needed to be tracked. Communications between radicalized individuals or between domestic terror groups also needed to be intercepted. The role of the post office in these operations wasn't passive. Postal inspectors worked in tandem with law enforcement agencies to identify suspicious mail, flag potential threats, and build cases against criminal organizations. In many ways, the post office had become one of the nation's first lines of defense against both international and domestic threats. This role was highlighted during the early years of the War on Terror, when authorities intercepted countless pieces of mail suspected of containing communications between terrorist cells. Even ordinary letters, when paired with other forms of intelligence, could offer valuable insights into the movements and plans of criminal organizations. This reliance on the post office as a security tool, however, came with significant ethical concerns. Many civil rights organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, began raising questions about the balance between security and privacy. They argued that the post office, once a symbol of personal communication, had been transformed into a tool for mass surveillance without adequate oversight. The U.S. government maintained that these surveillance measures were necessary for national security. Officials argued that mail surveillance was only used in cases of legitimate threats, and that the information collected through these programs was vital for preventing future attacks. However, as the scope of these programs expanded, so did the potential for abuse. By the mid-2010s, the public had begun to learn more about the extent of the post office's involvement in national security. Journalists and whistleblowers exposed the use of mail tracking and broader surveillance programs, many of which operated without warrants or adequate transparency. Investigative reports revealed how law enforcement agencies were using the postal system to track not just criminals and terrorists, but also political activists and journalists. The post office, once seen as a mundane public service, was now viewed in a more sinister light. The sheer volume of data it collected, tracking every letter and package sent within the United States, meant that it had become an incredibly powerful tool for the government. What had once been a system designed to facilitate communication had become a sprawling network for monitoring and controlling the flow of information. Despite these revelations, the post office's role in national security continued to grow. As new technologies emerged, the post office adopted even more advanced surveillance methods. Blockchain technologies were integrated into mail tracking systems, making it possible to create even more secure and detailed records of correspondence. These records were shared with law enforcement agencies, ensuring that no letter went untracked. At the same time, biometric identification technologies began to make their way into the postal system. The integration of fingerprint and facial recognition systems allowed authorities to verify the identities of those sending and receiving mail. This data, combined with the existing surveillance infrastructure, provided an even more comprehensive view of communication networks across the country. As these new technologies became more pervasive, the ethical questions surrounding mail surveillance only deepened. The balance between security and privacy became increasingly difficult to maintain. Should the government have the power to track every letter, package, and postcard sent within the country? Should individuals have the right to privacy when sending personal correspondence? Or should national security concerns take precedence? The post office, once an unremarkable institution, now stood at the center of this debate. It was no longer just a facilitator of communication. It was a key player in the broader surveillance state. As the 21st century unfolds, the role of the post office in surveillance and national security is likely to become even more pronounced. New technologies, such as quantum computing and AI-driven surveillance systems, are poised to revolutionize how mail is tracked and analyzed. The ability to track, photograph, and analyze every piece of mail sent within the country will only become more sophisticated, raising even more profound ethical questions about privacy and the role of government surveillance in everyday life. The future of mail surveillance will be shaped by several key factors. First, the ongoing development of AI will allow authorities to analyze communication patterns more efficiently than ever before. Machine learning algorithms will be able to detect subtle patterns in correspondence that human analysts would miss, allowing law enforcement agencies to uncover criminal networks and terrorist cells with greater accuracy. Second, the integration of blockchain technologies will make it easier for the post office to create detailed, tamper-proof records of correspondence. Blockchain's decentralized nature will provide a higher level of security, ensuring that records cannot be altered or deleted without authorization. However, this same technology will also make it more difficult for individuals to maintain privacy in their communications, as every letter and package will be permanently recorded and traceable. Finally, advances in biometric technologies will make it even harder for individuals to send mail anonymously. Fingerprint and facial recognition systems will become standard in postal services, allowing authorities to verify the identities of everyone sending or receiving mail. This level of identification, while beneficial for security purposes, will raise significant concerns about government overreach and the erosion of personal privacy. In the end, the future of mail surveillance will depend on how society chooses to balance the competing interests of security and privacy. The post office, once a symbol of free and open communication, has evolved into a powerful tool for monitoring and controlling the flow of information. As new technologies continue to reshape the way we communicate, the question of how much power the government should have over our private correspondence will become more pressing than ever. The post office's transformation from a simple mail delivery service to a key player in the surveillance state reflects the broader trends of the 21st century. As technology advances, the line between personal privacy and government control will continue to blur. Whether this evolution leads to greater security or a loss of individual freedom remains to be seen. One thing is certain, however: the post office will continue to play a central role in shaping the future of communication, surveillance, and the relationship between the government and its citizens.